Hello, I'm weather impact meteorologist Gary Frank, and welcome. With all the flooding in recent weeks and months, it often brings up the question from a lot of us, is this normal or is this related to climate change? Now, some of your questions and comments from the post I made about this in our Weather Watchers group on Facebook included a few of these, like, we don't get regular rain anymore, just massive downpours. My basement has never flooded before, and it flooded pretty good once during the March 18th storm, and then minor flooding 2 other times since the spring. Or the melting glaciers is the problem I see. Is this actually climate change or just the weather? That's a popular one as well. Or the climate on this planet in the grand scheme of things has and always will be in flux. I'd be willing to bet that no matter what we as humans do, the climate is going to do what the climate is going to do. But why exactly do we have these heavier rains in the spring and summer? April, May, and June are technically our wettest months in the area. One of the main reasons for this, the temperature goes up. And as the temperature goes up, the amount of moisture the air can hold goes up as well. That's why the correlation between heavy rainfall, climate change, conversations always come into play. But what does this mean for us locally? I spoke to Senior Service Hydrologist Mark Fuchs with the National Weather Service office in St. Louis to get some answers on how some of these things affect us locally and any trends he's noticed.
Why do we get more of these types of rains during the summer versus when we get in the fall and winter?
That's fairly easy. Warmer air holds more moisture. Occasionally you will get very heavy rainfall in the winter, but it's an anomalous event. It's a little more forecastable on the positive side. You might remember from several years ago, that is the late December 2015. We had a huge event across the Merrimack River Basin and down into Oklahoma, across southwest Missouri. But we had floods of record along the Merrimack. But it was something that, because it was a cold season event, and because modeling is just much better at predicting large scale cold season events as opposed to its warm season counterparts, we had watches and warnings in effect well in advance of this actually affecting us, and it was great. It worked out real well. It was a bad event, but I don't think anybody was killed. It was what you'd like to see. Unfortunately, the summer, yes, warm air. The warmer the air, the more capacity that air has to hold more moisture and have higher dew points, etc., higher mixing ratios, and that translates into bigger chances for thunderstorms, by their very nature of thunderstorms, especially in July and August. Thunderstorms are much more unpredictable. We can say, yeah, there's a chance of rain, but you might get 5 inches of rain. Your neighbor gets practically nothing, if not nothing. And we've seen a lot of that in the last couple of weeks around here. We've had big rain events. One hit St. Louis not too long ago. We had 2 to 3 inches of rain across the city and county, and there was some folks just south of us that had very little rain, and it's just the nature of the beast.
From some of the things from a flooding standpoint, how important is it that what kind of drought we're in prior to one of these rainfall rates? Sometimes we obviously enter the warm months of May, June, July, meteorological summer, and we haven't had very much snowpack upstream. The rivers aren't swollen, or maybe it's drier, or now we see obviously what comes to forefront of mind is what happened in Texas, where it's very dry and all of a sudden you get all this rain. How important is it from that standpoint? Is one able to hold the other, or how does that impact our flooding and flash flooding forecast locally and regionally?
That's a multifaceted question. It might take me a half hour to answer that one.
It's okay.
I'm not going to do that though.
I know.
But so the soil acts as a sponge, right? And so the drier that sponge is, the greater capacity it has to absorb water. Now, some folks uh, will get the idea that if it's too dry and the soil's too hard, it can act as a source of impervious runoff, where all the water goes rushing into the stream and everything comes up immediately. But that's not quite how it works, Gary. It maybe very briefly at the beginning of the event, it might have some of that quality to it, but once the ground softens up, yeah, that ground, if it's dry, it's going to absorb a lot of water. That's a big if. Now, if that ground is saturated, then yes, all that rain that falls quickly turns into runoff, and then we have big problems. Whenever you get 10 inches or more, in Texas case, 10 to 20 inches of rain over one spot, we had situations similar to that. You may remember just a few years ago in July of 2022, July 26th, we had a massive flash flood event across St. Charles County and into St. Louis County and into the city. And we had up to 14 plus inches of rain out of that event. Whenever you have that much rain, it doesn't really matter how wet or dry your soil is. You're going to have some significant flash flooding. Granted, it's going to be it'll take some of the edge off initially, but when you get that much water in a short period of time, look out. And that's what they had down in Texas. And that's the kind of scenario that we really try to be careful of. And when it presents itself, we like to get those warnings out and have the partners know of this going on as quickly as possible, because that's it's a very dangerous situation, as dangerous really as any tornado.
Have we seen any increase in frequency in the St. Louis area or regionally in flash flooding over the last few years? You mentioned obviously the one I can think of that it was, like you mentioned, 22 in St. Peter's. We have a couple, right? We're always good for one or two of them per year, depending, and it's locally, like you mentioned. Obviously, when it's hot, when it's warmer, even in the fall and winter, when the ground obviously, gets frozen and we get rain runoff in a different situation. Is there a frequency on both seasons, one season, or just collectively that you've seen?
Oh, we've been collecting some flash flood statistics here locally. I was looking at some that one of my coworkers put together that dated back to the early aughts. I want to say 2000, I don't know, 4, 5, somewhere in there. And I don't remember why we stopped at that time and why we didn't go back farther. I think part of it was the availability of some types of data. But in any case, what it shows pretty clearly is that there is a max of flash flooding in July. July is a big month for flash flooding. And it's also pretty big in August and in June on either side of it. And as you might imagine, as it gets into the cold season, that flash flood potential lessens quite a bit. And we don't really see it that much in December or January. Even that event I was mentioning for 2015, a December event during an El Nino year, that really wasn't a flash flood event. It was just a bunch of rain over a 3-day period. And those totals then accumulated over 2 to 3 days for the most part. And that resulted in horrific flooding along the Merrimack and the Burbus and the Black and some other rivers. The Big, I believe, was affected pretty badly. But that's more of a widespread synoptic event as opposed to a micro scale, small stream, small creek event that can happen in a matter of just 6 to 12 hours. And that's what we saw down in Texas, really. It was a lot of things happening on a shorter time scale. And that's what we saw in 2022 and last year when the Nashville dam had issues over in Nashville, Illinois. these events can materialize very quickly when you get several inches of rain over just a few hours, and then it just keeps raining. Um, you have training of convective storms along a common line, and that line just keeps getting it. Now, the folks to the north or south of that line may get very little or nothing, but don't try telling that to the folks in the middle, because they're really dealing with it on a big scale.
You mentioned that training, and it seems, from an observational standpoint, right? Just even being around, lived here for 3+ years now, but driven back and forth and being in Kansas City in the Midwest. And, it seems like some of these stationary boundaries, we get these areas where training of rain, even some of the blocking highs that seem to not want to move, and then we get stuck in this pattern, right? Can sometimes lead to more of these heavy rainfall rates, not only during the course of the hours, or course of the day. Why does this even happen in the nighttime hours sometimes? Can you point out the science behind that, and why we kind of get stuck with some of this recently?
Yeah, it's the nocturnal jet is an interesting feature that is common out in the plains during MCS season, which is often in June, July, and August, really. And we see a persistent, oftentimes at 850 millibars, 5,000 to 8,000 feet up, a strong jet stream developing at those levels that intensifies at that time of night, and you tend to have horrific rainfall at the wrong hour of the day. I mean, it's fine. It's easier to deal with when we're all awake and aware of what's going on. You add darkness to the equation, it's a whole different animal, and it's really it becomes a challenge for us in the Weather Service to adequately warn people at those hours, because they're usually sleeping.
Is there anything that points to the warmer temperatures, year end to year end, causing and climate change causing any of this? I mean, I know you guys went back to your study from 2004, even not from a perspective of, you have hard data that suggests this from, yeah, we're starting to see more of them more frequent, right? Or just anecdotally, or maybe just a little bit of both, right? Like, just from a meteorologist perspective that has lived here for many years, that has studied this on a day-to-day basis, have you seen anything that maybe jumps out to you that maybe gives us an answer one way or the other, or is something that we could research down the road?
It is worthy of research, of course. And anecdotally, it seems like I've seen a lot of high-end precipitation events in the summer, perhaps on a more frequent basis than I used to. But when I look back at some of this data that I mentioned earlier, that goes back 20+ years, that actually kind of implies the opposite. It implies that flash flood frequency might be slightly decreasing, although there's high years, there's low years. But overall, if you had to apply a trend line to the graph, it does show maybe a slightly lesser occurrence of flash flooding, with perhaps more frequent periods of drought, mixed in there to kind of dampen whatever signal there is for flash flooding. I'm not sure. It is a field ripe for research, for sure. I can't say we have any definitive answers connecting any kind of perceived increase in flash flooding or rainfall rates to climate change. You could suspect that it may be there, simply because what I said at the top, warmer temperatures tend to hold more water, and if we are seeing warmer temperatures aloft, as I think we are, over the last X number of years, that would imply that there could be a greater chance of flash flooding. But like I said, the shorter term data doesn't really indicate it.
Every year is different, though. And we had a rainy start to the year, but things have really dried out recently. Where are we this year so far, and how does that stack up against recent memory? I chatted with Missouri State climatologist Zach Leeser to get an idea of where we stand and his thoughts on whether or not our climate has been impacted locally.
Well, first off, let's talk about the differences between the last few years because it seems like, we obviously had our front load of rain on the start of the year, obviously March, April, and even May. And even though it's dried out as it so often does, it feels like we haven't had any of the big flooding rains. So tell us what's the difference other than the fact that we are pretty drought free throughout the state to this point.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And it's really been a different growing season since 2022, 23, 24, where we've worried about drought. We started wet in April, and May was closer to average, but it's really our wettest time of year. Then June was another above average rainfall month, and we're already an inch ahead of average for July as well. So have really strung together this stretch of abnormal wetness, and it's really eliminated a lot of the drought. And so along with that has come flooding, and so we've had 150 flash flood warnings statewide issued so far this year. Our statewide average is 159, so safe to say we will break that average and finish with more flash flood warnings, but doesn't look like a record year. And river flood warnings, we're really kind of on pace for average. So most of the flooding that we've seen with this excessive rainfall has come through flash flood warning and not river floods.
It seems like the last 2 to 3 years we've seen more flash floods area wide than we do. Is that something just off the top of your head? You said the average obviously is 159. What part does that carry for the entire year, or is that just for the summertime, or how is that measured?
Yeah, so that carries for the entire year. So here at 150 and looking at Kansas City today, we might hit our average today as well, just because we'll likely add some more flash flood warnings with what's going on in Northwest Missouri.
That carries in. So have you seen is there an uptick in frequency of those over the last few years? Has this been one of those things where the average of flash flood warnings has started to go up? And if so, do you think that is just because of the nature of the way that we're starting to see more urban areas impact flash floods, or do you think there's another correlation to that, just as we've kind of seen things over the last few years?
Yeah, good question. And the same kind of holds with severe weather trends as well. When we look at warnings or reports for flooding and severe weather, there's a lot of variability from year to year and almost random variability. It's really hard to pick out trends there. But no, we're actually not seeing an increase in flash flood warnings in recent years. But a big part of that is the data is kind of loaded where 2015 to 2020 was really wet in Missouri. And we had a lot of flash flood warnings and river flood warnings, but we've actually been drier in the 2020s so far. And so kind of equalizes there. But I do think, when you think about the vulnerability to flash flooding, certainly the more urban areas, the more runoff you get from those rainfall events there. So, and then when we think about river flooding, even though we've been, wet in Missouri, a lot of the central U.S. and the plains where our water comes through the Missouri and Mississippi River basins have been dealing with drought for what feels like 4 or 5 years now. So when we have been seeing river flooding, it's kind of those smaller tributaries, but we haven't had any prolonged floods on the Mississippi or Missouri like we saw in the 2010s.
But when you speak to farmers, is there some sort of correlation and causation between the two where you see they would have either a preference for drought and then being busted by some of these extreme heavy rains? Are these things that they're preparing for, or are these things that they have seen in trends over the last few years if they notice temperature trends go up over the next few years and then rainfall rates go up in any sense? Is that something that they're noticing as well?
Yeah, so I think if you talk to farmers, they'll present challenges on both the dry and wet side. So I think farmers are very happy that they were not thinking about drought and lack of water for plants this year, but it's also come with its own challenges. I know in April and May when it was really wet, it's really difficult to get out in the field and plant. And in some spots, there have been, a lot of crops that have gotten too much water at the wrong time. So this is kind of a common occurrence in Missouri, but I also do think there's a general awareness that with these warmer temperatures we're seeing, we can see more extreme rainfall. And so that might not play out for our whole year, but you get these storms that have a little bit more energy for that extreme precipitation. And so that's something to think about in Missouri, because our climate is already one where we can see drought punctuated by heavy rain and go right back to drought. But if that becomes more extreme in the future, it's just going to be even more difficult to manage water during the growing season.
Like off the top of my head, especially just focusing on some of these subjects the last 2, 3, 4 years, we've had some very warm years statistically in St. Louis and our surrounding areas.
Yeah.
But as you know, the state of Missouri, we're still, even with all the rain, it seems like we're still relatively warm this year from a statistics standpoint, but it's not something that maybe jumps out at us simply because it has rained a bunch. Does that seem accurate?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so I do think the rain is going to moderate our temperatures this year, where we're not going to have like record breaking or top five warmest year on record here, but we're running above average. And so through the first 6 months, our statewide average temperature is 1.2 degrees above average. If we were to look at 130 years of statewide data, that ranks as about 35th warmest. Now it looks like we're going to add a little bit warmer in July as well, so that number will tick up. But yeah, all signs point with 6 months remaining here in the year that we'll see yet another warmer than average year, despite all of the precipitation. And unless we really turn things off and go into a drought, we should finish as a wetter year in 2025.
Necessarily it's going to be like this every single year, right? We understand that, when we talk about the potential for climate change, right? I try to talk about this on both sides of the aisle, where some people, really think that it is, impacting us locally all the time, or some people maybe think that these are the ebbs and flows, like you just mentioned, where like you said, 5 years it was very dry, and then all of a sudden we transitioned to a wet period. Do you see any trend in these ebbs and flows in a sense of a climate standpoint? Is this changing from a standpoint of the last 25 years, as we typically measure these from the 1990 to 2010 standpoint, or those periods? Is there a trend that you see that maybe is either impacting rainfall rates, snowfall rates, or more flash flooding in months that we wouldn't expect it, like June, July, or August?
Yeah, great question. And when I think about Missouri's climate, I really break it into three periods, starting in some of the most famous years you get from the 1930s to the 1950s. This was warm and dry for Missouri. Most of our statewide temperature records still stand from that period, lots of drought years. Then we went to the kind of 1960s to around 1990, cooler and wetter during that period. And then, as you mentioned, we get into our most recent period, really the past 35 years, 1990 to present. What we're seeing is warmer and wetter. And so it is another warm period that we're in for the state, but it's almost a different flavor. So we're not seeing some of the heat from the 30s and 50s, because we've also got wetter conditions as well. And so when we look at our trends over the past 30 years, it's actually surprising to a lot of people, but statewide, our summertime maximum temperatures are actually slightly decreasing. Now, all other times of the year and our minimum temperatures, those are increasing more strongly because of that moisture. And so some of our biggest trends right now are the coldest times of the year, so low temperatures during the winter and spring, are getting warmer. And that's kind of increasing our growing season, increasing our periods for severe weather potential as well, kind of the seasons for those. And so while I don't think we have enough data to get then to the impact level and really understand our frequency for the hazards, we can definitely take some of the temperature and precipitation information and kind of see that our vulnerability can increase with warmer and wetter as well.
That are interested about climate related things and how it pertains to our local weather and regional weather, is there something that they should think about moving forward going into the future, whether or not it's something that they can do or something that they could learn, or something that just pertains to them moving in the next 20 years, when perhaps we either see these trends or maybe they flip the other way in a sense? Is there something that they should know or be interested in?
Yeah, absolutely. I think your suggestion is great. Is prepare for uncertainty. So we can't predict the future in 20 years with certainty, but we can look at all of this variability and tell you that looking at Missouri's past climate, that we expect things to change. It's something that happens, and so planning around the climate, especially in agriculture. What are we going to do if we're warmer and seeing more extreme precipitation? Or what are we going to do if we see cooler temperatures as well? And so, not just planning around, the weather over the past few years, but really kind of fully understanding that climate to better be prepared for all range of circumstances.
Climate Central is an independent group of scientists and communicators who report about facts and changing climate and how it affects people's lives. As listed on their website, they're a policy-neutral 501c3 nonprofit that uses data, science, and technology to help make climate change personal and show what you can do about it. They provide graphics and that you may have seen us use on the air before, and local storylines that personalize it with sea level rise, extreme weather, and energy among the topics covered. I spoke to Christina Dahl, their Vice President for Science, to understand these topics better and to get some insight on how our area may be affected.
What is Climate Central's ultimate mission? What does Climate Central do? This is something, that we're familiar with as meteorologists. Sometimes you see it on some of the national stories a little bit to provide some of this data, but tell us a little bit about exactly what Climate Central does in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, well, we know from opinion polling that climate change is a topic that is important to a lot of people in the United States. But we also know that very few people regularly see or hear or about climate change in the media. And we know that even fewer people are talking about it with their friends and family and neighbors. And so, what Climate Central aims to do is highlight climate change science and get that scientific information to journalists, to meteorologists, to teachers, to all sorts of people who have the opportunity to share that information in the course of their day-to-day work and reach a broad audience so that the American public is seeing that information more often and hearing about it and potentially talking about it.
And so, from a perspective of, now that we've seen 3 or 4 big floods, obviously the one that grabbed our attention the most, these overnight floods, these nocturnal floods, the one being Texas, but we had some other larger ones. As we get into, season with, a little bit more hurricanes, it's more of an active part of hurricane season. We're going to see these stalled lows and stalled tropical systems that could eventually impact us, but they produce a lot of moisture and a good moisture stream for us. When you see things like these, is this something that you have seen a frequency increase? Is there a number of years that goes back to? Is it within the last 20 years? Do you guys have a metric, and how are you gathering this data?
Yeah, well, there are a lot of different ways that you can measure precipitation and a lot of different ways that you can slice the data to show whether heavy precipitation events are changing in frequency or whether they're getting more severe. And the story is usually pretty clear, no matter how you slice the data, that across the United States, since about the 1950s, we've seen an increase in the amount of rain that's falling in the heaviest events. So our severe rainfall events are getting stronger, getting more rain in those heavy events. In the St. Louis, Missouri area, since about the 1970s, there's been about a 20% increase in rainfall intensity. So what you're seeing at that local level is really mirrored by a broader trend across the United States. And so when we see an event like the heavy rain that just caused such devastating flooding in central Texas, it's really consistent with this broader climate-driven trend that we're seeing in lots of parts of the country.
June and July obviously are some of our hotter months, and as the temperature rises, it has the ability to hold more moisture. Therefore, our rainfall rates are going to be higher this month anyway, right? We run into, some times where we get no rain for 10 days, and all of a sudden we get a lot of significant rain. Is that something that you're seeing outside of just, say, the summer months as well? Is that something that's kind of bleeding into the fall and even winter in terms of precipitation or even advanced flash flooding and rainfall rates?
Yeah, that's a great question. So There's a lot of variability in precipitation. And like you're saying, you can one June have 10 days of no rain. The next June, you've got 10 days of heavy rain. It's very spotty, which makes it difficult in some ways to characterize the trends. But we know that as the climate changes, precipitation is changing in terms of like the intensity and the seasonality of it. And I don't have specific stats for your area on how it's changing season by season, but we do know that as the climate continues to warm, we'll continue to see changes in when, where, and how much precipitation you're getting.
A perspective of, that kind of thing where you mentioned where, as we continue to warm and we get these different seasons, is there something that specifically, I think the number one thing I think about that maybe every time some sort of major event happens, now we're drawn to say that is directed to climate change, right? I think, and then maybe the people that definitely want to listen, we have, listeners that maybe yeah, this is definitely a thing, but I'm also skeptical to see why it maybe is pushed on us every event. Is there something that you can say to those people to maybe say, listen, not every event is that way, or maybe more of these events are starting to come into play, and how do we know that from data and just studying this on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, well, I think that something that's really highlighted by these recent floods in Texas is the fact that we as a broad society aren't very well equipped right now to dealing with the level of rain and flooding that we have today, right? We see the ways in which our preparedness failed to adequately prevent the level of devastation and tragedy that we just had in Texas, right? So I think it's probably pretty commonly agreed we need to do better, right? And in order to actually do better, we need to know not just what would have helped in this situation, but what is going to help given what the future looks like. And so that's why it's important to bring this climate change story in when we have extreme rains, because it's not enough just to say, oh, we needed to prepare differently for this level of event that we had this week or this month. We need to be looking out into the future when we're thinking about how prepared we need to be, because the future is going to look different. And in order to have the level of preparedness that we need to have for the future, we do need public demand for it. The changes we need to see in our society will cost money. They need to be thoughtfully carried out. They need to involve community participation. And all of those things take time and resources that, unless we collectively say that we value in our country, it's difficult to muster. It's difficult to see the change that you'll need. And you can even see that in the case of these Texas floods. There were people for years, even a decade or more, saying we need a better warning system. We need to install these sirens. And the conversation was difficult. Cost was an issue, willingness was an issue. And so, it's difficult to see us prioritizing the level of preparation that we need for the future, unless we are having an honest conversation about what that future looks like.
Locally, speaking from our National Weather Service office and sitting in with meetings with them, the number one thing, and I talked to Mark, was about is they use, the wireless emergency activation on phones. That's the number one thing. And probably, even when we see people tornado sirens, we have plenty of sirens everywhere. Every emergency manager is different in how they're going to sound them. So
Right.
from a local perspective, that's kind of how we operate things. What would be something that you would suggest if somebody is saying, hey, I believe that this is occurring? What are the steps that I can take if the rainfall rates are more frequent and more heavy? And I know at some point, one of these statistically anomalous 1 in 100-year, 1 in 1,000-year floods is going to impact me. What is a step that they can take to be prepared for it? And what is a step that perhaps maybe going forward further what is a step that they can do to say, well, climate change is going to impact me. How can I do a better, what can I do personally to maybe ensure whatever it is for myself or for my family years down the road?
Yeah, I guess I would say that one of the most critical things is to make sure that you're signed up for those alerts and that you're getting them from the National Weather Service when they're coming out. I've heard some National Weather Service folks say that they worry about warning people too often, right? If you live in an area where flash flooding is common, you know that it can be very spotty, right? It might flood 2 blocks away, but not at your house. And so, um, the folks who are sending out those alerts are conscious of the fact that they don't want to be bothering people and having people receive, 10 alerts a day about flooding that never materializes on their block. But you need to take those alerts seriously, right? Because we can't always predict exactly where the flooding is going to happen or exactly where the rainfall is going to be heaviest. Just scientifically, that's a really, really difficult thing to do. And so those alerts are necessarily going out to more people than they ultimately will need to, right? You're not going to need to evacuate everyone in the whole area that's getting alerted, but everyone in the area should be aware of that flooding is a possibility and they need to be prepared for it. And in terms of one thing that people can do to prepare for the future, I think there are a million ways that I could answer that question, and ultimately it comes down to personal preferences. But I know as someone living in California where we have earthquakes, having a go bag in your front hall closet or in your car or somewhere that is just packed with emergency supplies, an emergency weather alert radio, food for a couple days, just having that stuff ready so that if you do get an alert and you see that it's happening on your block, you're ready to evacuate. Is just I know for me, it's been a real step to bring some peace of mind so that I know if the big one hits, we've got a bag and we can get out of the house if we need to. And same with flooding.
So what does all of this information conclude? Well, there's still lots of research to be done on the topic. As Mark and Zach both said above, there are certainly some correlations between the two, but that's not grounds for believing that every single event should be correlated to climate change. The bottom line, warmer air holds more moisture, but how that directly impacts climate change still needs to be studied and will continue to be so. We all notice that some of these local weather patterns change over time. As they do, those who have lived in the area for many years recognize things aren't quite the same. But as far as recognizing a correlation between the two, we will continue to do more research, ask questions, and answer your questions in the best way possible. Thanks for joining us. I'm Weather Impact Meteorologist Gary Frank.